David Calloway's mansion, filled with the echoes of forgotten laughter and the weight of countless achievements, stood silent, a reflection of a life he never intended to lead. Once, it had been filled with love. His son Michael, his pride and joy, had been his world. But that was before the accident that took Michael's life a decade ago. Since then, the mansion, with its walls adorned with priceless artwork and rare artifacts, had been a cage, trapping him in his grief. Nothing filled the void left by Michael's absence. Every Sunday morning, without fail, David would visit Michael's grave. The cemetery, an hour's drive from his mansion, was his only escape from the emptiness. The grave, tucked between towering oak trees, whispered the memories of his son with every rustling leaf. It was the only place where David allowed himself to show vulnerability. But on one particular Sunday, something was different. As David approached Michael's grave with a bouquet of flowers, he noticed a boy. No older than 12, with dark hair and a slight frame, the boy stood in front of the headstone. David paused, confusion creeping in. Who was this child, and why was he standing by Michael's grave? The boy wasn't simply passing by. He was there with purpose. David could see him talking softly, as if having a conversation with the stone. David's heart skipped a beat. He had to know what was going on. His eyes narrowed as he took a cautious step forward, calling out, "Hey, what are you doing here?" His voice was firm, but there was an edge of curiosity. The boy turned sharply, his eyes wide with fear. For a brief moment, their gazes locked, David's intense and piercing, the boy's wide with panic. Without a word, the boy bolted, his legs carrying him swiftly toward the woods at the edge of the cemetery. "Wait!" David shouted, dropping the flowers and chasing after him. But the boy was quick, disappearing into the thick trees before David could get close. David stopped at the edge of the woods, breathing heavily. His heart pounded, not from the exertion, but from the questions swirling in his mind. Why had this boy been at Michael's grave? What did he have to do with his son? As David stood there, still trying to catch his breath, the sun dipped lower, casting an orange glow over the scene. His mind raced with possibilities, but one thing was certain. The encounter with the boy had ignited something inside him. A spark of curiosity, of confusion, and maybe, just maybe, hope. That night, sleep eluded David. The boy's face lingered in his mind. There was something about the way he had moved, something familiar, almost as if he had known Michael. But it couldn't be. Michael had never mentioned a child. David tried to shake off the thought, but it clung to him like a shadow. By morning, he couldn't ignore it any longer. The mystery had taken root, and David knew he had to find answers. Who was this boy? What connection did he have to Michael? The moment David stepped into his office, he picked up the phone and dialed the number of his private investigator, Greg. Greg had solved countless cases for him, from simple missing persons to complicated financial fraud. If anyone could find out the truth about the boy, it would be Greg. "Greg, I need you to find someone for me," David said, his voice sharp with urgency. "A boy, around 12. Thin, dark hair. He was at my son's grave yesterday." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "A boy at the grave? What's going on?" "David, I don't know," David muttered. "But I need to know who he is and why he was there." Greg's voice was steady. "Consider it done. I'll get back to you with what I find." Days passed, but David's mind remained consumed by thoughts of the boy. His usual focus on business deals, investments, and meetings had vanished. Instead, he replayed the encounter over and over, searching for meaning in the boy's actions, his face, and the way he had looked at him. Then, after 5 long days, Greg called. "I've got the information you wanted," Greg said. David felt a rush of anticipation. "Tell me." "His name is Ethan. He lives with his mother, Sarah, in a small town about 40 minutes away. They moved there a few years ago. Ethan visits the cemetery once or twice a month, always alone." David's heart skipped a beat. He opened the file that Greg had sent over. Inside, there were photos of Ethan and his mother, Sarah. As he stared at Ethan's face, David was struck by how much the boy resembled Michael. Dark eyes, the same mischievous smile. And Sarah, her eyes, they seemed to carry a deep sadness that mirrored his own. David's mind was racing. Could it be? Could this boy be his grandson? Why was he visiting Michael's grave? David asked, his voice tight. Greg's voice was cautious. I don't know, but it's clear the boy has been visiting regularly. Maybe it's best if you talk to them directly. David's fingers trembled as he set down the file. His heart was pounding in his chest. What was going on? Why was this boy, Ethan, visiting his son's grave? Without another word, David hung up the phone, the answer gnawing at the back of his mind. The next morning, David drove to the small town where Ethan and Sarah lived. It was a modest place, the houses simple, the streets quiet. His sleek black car seemed out of place among the small homes, and the neighbors watched with curiosity as he stepped out. David knocked on the door, his pulse racing. Moments later, Sarah answered. Her face was a mask of surprise and wariness, but her eyes quickly softened as she took in David's presence. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice cautious. David hesitated, his mind racing. "I'm David Calloway," he began. "I believe you know something about my son, Michael." For a moment, Sarah didn't move. Her face went pale, and David could see the emotions flashing in her eyes. Fear, sorrow, and something else, something deeper. "Please," Sarah said, stepping aside. "Come in." As David entered the small living room, he noticed the family photos on the walls. In one, Ethan was holding a small trophy, his face beaming with pride. Beside him, Sarah smiled, a proud mother. It was a simple home, but it was filled with warmth, something David hadn't felt in years. "Why was your son visiting my son's grave?" David demanded, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Sarah paused, her face tightening as she gathered her thoughts. Her hands trembled as she sat down across from him. "There's something I need to tell you," she began, her voice fragile. "It's not something I wanted to bring up, not something I thought you'd even believe. But Ethan, his Michael's son." David froze. His world seemed to tilt. His mind struggled to process the words, but they echoed in his ears like a thunderclap. Michael's son? It couldn't be. Michael had never. But before he could voice his disbelief, Sarah continued. "Michael and I were together for a short time," Sarah explained. "We were young, and things were complicated. He never knew. I didn't find out I was pregnant until after he was gone." David's heart pounded in his chest, his hands gripping the armrest of the chair. Michael had a child? His son had a son? All these years of silence, of grief, was it possible that everything he had thought he knew was about to shatter? David's chest tightened as the words hit him like a wave. Ethan was right. In some way, Michael had known this moment would come. Maybe this was Michael's way of bringing the family together, of giving David a second chance. A chance to rebuild what had been broken. For the first time in years, David felt something he hadn't thought possible. Hope. David's mind swirled as he sat on the porch, watching Ethan's bright eyes reflect the last of the evening sunlight. There, in the presence of his grandson, he felt a strange sense of peace that had eluded him for years. The pain of losing Michael still lingered deep in his chest, but now, there was something else, something new. Ethan's words had struck a chord within him. Maybe that's why he brought us together. Michael, in some unseen way, had ensured his father wouldn't remain alone forever. For the first time since Michael's death, David could see the threads of his life beginning to weave together again. Maybe not as perfectly as he once imagined, but the beginning of something real. Something that could heal the parts of him that had always felt broken. But it wasn't going to be easy. He could already tell that much. Over the next week, David made it a point to visit Sarah and Ethan as often as possible. He didn't just show up with expensive gifts or extravagant promises anymore. He learned to listen. He spent time with Ethan, helping him with homework, teaching him things about the world, and sharing stories of his own childhood. He wasn't just trying to be a grandfather. He was trying to be a presence, a reliable, steady force in their lives. And, for the first time in a long time, he could sense that they were beginning to trust him. Sarah, too, seemed to warm to David's efforts. She was wary at first, understandably so, but gradually she opened up. They spent hours talking late into the night. Sarah told him about the struggle she had faced as a single mother, about the weight of raising Ethan on her own, and about the challenges of moving forward without Michael. David didn't have the answers she needed, but he listened, and that, for Sarah, was more than enough. Still, A part of David couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more he needed to do. His wealth and influence had always been the tools he used to solve problems, but now they seemed insignificant compared to what he was learning. The most important thing wasn't money, it was the time he had to spend with Sarah and Ethan. It was building relationships, even if it meant giving up the comfort of the life he had known. One evening, after dinner, David sat down with Sarah and Ethan in the living room. The house was small, but it felt warm, filled with the kind of life that had been absent from his own home for far too long. Ethan was playing with a toy car on the floor, while Sarah was flipping through a photo album, her brow furrowed in concentration. David cleared his throat, catching both their attention. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice slow but deliberate. "I want to make things right. I want to be here for you both, but I don't want to just give you things. I want to be part of your lives. Not in the way I've tried before, but in a way that matters." Sarah looked up, a soft smile playing at the corners of her lips. "You've already started doing that," she said quietly. "You don't need to buy us anything, David. You're already giving us something priceless." David swallowed, a knot forming in his throat. He didn't know what to say. He wasn't used to being vulnerable, used to speaking from the heart. But with them, he found the courage to let his guard down. "I was thinking about moving here," David said suddenly, as if the words had been sitting on his tongue for days, waiting for the right moment. "Not permanently, but often. I don't want to be just a visitor. I want to be a part of this family." There was silence in the room, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Sarah blinked, as though surprised by the offer. Ethan looked up, his eyes wide and thoughtful. "I don't need to live in the mansion," David continued, his gaze fixed on Sarah. "But I can be here when you need me. And I want to help, whatever it takes. Maybe we could fix this house up, make it better for you." Sarah's gaze softened, but she shook her head gently. "David, we don't need your money. We're happy here, as we are. What I want is to have you here for real. Not as someone who thinks he can solve everything with cash or power. Just be present, in the way you've been lately." David felt the ache in his chest ease slightly. He had been so desperate to make up for lost time, to fix everything with grand gestures. But Sarah's words, simple, straightforward, reminded him of the importance of the small things, of showing up, of being there without expectation. "I can do that," David said quietly, a weight lifting from his shoulders. "I can do that for you, for Ethan. I won't try to buy my way into your lives anymore." Ethan, who had been listening intently, looked up from his toy car and offered a shy smile. "You're really gonna stick around?" he asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty but also a flicker of hope. David smiled back, his heart swelling with a love he had never known before. "I am. I promise." Over the next few months, David continued to visit. But instead of trying to force things, he simply allowed the bond between them to grow naturally. He wasn't just helping with the house anymore, he was becoming a regular part of their world. Ethan came to trust him more and more, his guard slowly lowering as David proved that he wouldn't disappear. And Sarah, though still cautious, allowed herself to lean on him when she needed to. But as much as he tried to blend into their lives, David still couldn't forget the lingering feeling that something wasn't quite right. There were still so many unanswered questions about Michael's life, about Sarah's past, and about how they had ended up in such a quiet, unassuming place while David had built his empire. One day, after another long conversation with Sarah, David asked a question that had been gnawing at him for weeks. "Sarah," he said, his voice tentative, "how did you end up here? How did you and Michael end up separated? I need to know." Sarah hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of the photo album in her lap. She looked at David, and for a moment, her face seemed to cloud over with a mixture of sadness and regret. "It's a long story," she said softly, "but I think it's time you knew the truth." David leaned forward, the weight of her words pulling him closer. Whatever the truth was, he knew it would change everything. Sarah's words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken emotions. David sat at the edge of his seat, heart racing with anticipation. The walls around him seemed to close in as he waited for Sarah to continue. Ethan, who had been playing quietly in the corner, glanced up, sensing the tension in the room. Sarah closed the photo album slowly, taking a deep breath as she looked at David, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resolve. "I never wanted to tell you, David," she began, her voice steady but with an underlying tremor. Not because I wanted to keep secrets, but because I thought it would hurt you even more. You already lost Michael, and I didn't want to drag up painful memories. But it's time you knew the whole story. David leaned forward, his eyes never leaving her face. His mind raced, his breath shallow. What could she possibly say that would change everything? When Michael and I were together, it was brief. He was kind, loving, everything I needed at that time. But there was a part of him that always felt torn between his family and his own sense of worth. He felt like he didn't fit into your world, that he wasn't enough for you. And that's why things ended between us, David. He never felt good enough for you. David felt the sharp sting of those words, a pang of guilt surging through him. He had always been focused on success, on his empire, his business, and the idea of perfection. Had he really made Michael feel like he wasn't enough? I knew about his struggles, Sarah continued, her voice quieter now. But we tried. We tried to make it work. And when he passed, I was left with no one. And then I found out I was pregnant with Ethan. I was alone, and I knew there was no way I could reach out to you, not after everything that had happened. Michael hadn't even told you about Ethan, not because he didn't want you to know, but because he didn't want you to feel like it was a burden. David's heart pounded in his chest. The weight of her words hit him like a tidal wave. He had failed his son in ways he couldn't even imagine. Michael had kept his son a secret not out of shame, but because of fear of rejection from his father, the man he'd never been able to live up to. I never meant to keep Ethan from you, Sarah said, her eyes softening. I wasn't looking for help, for money. I just wanted to raise him with love, the best I could. And I wanted to protect him from all the hurt that came from Michael's past, and yours, David. David sat back, the weight of it all settling heavily on his shoulders. He had spent years believing his wealth, his success, were the keys to happiness, to filling the void left by Michael's death. But now, he realized, it was the very things he had prioritized that had caused his son to suffer in silence. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice breaking. I never knew. I never saw it. Sarah reached across the table, her hand resting gently on his. You couldn't have known, David. Michael never gave you the chance to understand. And I didn't want to bring all this pain back into your life. But now, Ethan needs you, just as much as I do. David turned his gaze to Ethan, who had stopped playing and was now looking at him with wide, uncertain eyes. The boy's gaze held a quiet sadness, but also something else, something that told David this was no longer about the past. It was about what they could build together, from here forward. I've missed so much time, David said softly, his voice filled with remorse. But I want to make it right. I want to be here for both of you, truly. Not because I can give you everything, but because I want to be a part of your lives. Ethan smiled, a hesitant but genuine smile, and David felt something in his chest crack open. It wasn't the type of smile that promised everything would be perfect. It was the kind of smile that said they were ready to start over, to heal the wounds that had been festering for years. I'd like that, Grandpa, Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm glad you're here. David's heart swelled, and for the first time in a long time, he felt the weight of his success, his wealth, fall away. It wasn't the mansion, the cars, or the business deals that mattered. It was this moment, this new beginning with his grandson, the family he didn't know he had, and Sarah, who had been brave enough to keep Ethan's truth from him until the time was right. I don't need anything fancy, David said, his voice strong but filled with vulnerability. What I need is to be a family, to make up for lost time, no matter how long it takes. Sarah's eyes softened, and she nodded slowly. We're here, David. We're here now. From that day forward, David made a promise to himself, and to them, that he would never let his past mistakes define him. He would be the grandfather, the father, the man they needed him to be. It was going to take time, and it would be hard, but he was ready. As the weeks passed, David slowly let go of the empire he had built, finding peace in the small, quiet moments with Sarah and Ethan. He stopped chasing success and started chasing memories. He learned that the real measure of a man's life wasn't in the wealth he amassed or the power he wielded. It was in the relationships he nurtured, the bonds he forged, and the family he cherished. And one evening, as they all sat around the dinner table, laughter filling the room. David looked at Ethan and Sarah and knew without a doubt that this was the life he had been meant to live. This was home. "I'm glad I found you both," David said, his voice full of gratitude. "You've given me more than I could ever repay." Ethan smiled up at him, his eyes bright with the kind of joy David had never thought possible. "We're glad, too, Grandpa. We're glad, too." And for the first time in years, David Calloway felt complete. "She's not handling things well. But I know she went about it the wrong way. I talked to her about it. I just wanted to clear the air with you." Jamie leaned on his rake, considering Greg's words. "You're not the first one to come to me with an apology, but I appreciate it, Greg. This isn't about being right or wrong. It's about respecting each other. My pool, my rules." Greg nodded, seeming to understand. "You're right. You're absolutely right. And I'm sorry that it took all of this for people to realize that. We've been living here a long time, and I think some of us got a little too comfortable thinking we could just do whatever. I'll make sure Sandra doesn't pull anything like that again." Jamie gave him a nod of acknowledgement. "That's all I ask. Just respect." With that, Greg turned to leave. But before he got into his car, he stopped and glanced back at Jamie. "You know, it's funny," Greg said with a small grin. "I don't think anyone's ever had the guts to stand up to Sandra like that. You've got guts, man." Jamie smiled back, feeling the weight of the past few months finally lift. Sometimes, you just have to remind people who they're dealing with. As the days went on, things slowly returned to normal. Jamie could finally relax, knowing that his home, and his peace, was his again. Sandra stayed quiet, no longer testing his patience. The neighborhood, once tense and divided, seemed to settle into a new rhythm. People respected each other more, and Jamie could finally enjoy his quiet life again, free from the constant worry that someone might just take what wasn't theirs. In the end, it wasn't about winning. It was about standing up for what was right, about proving that boundaries, once established, are not to be crossed. And Jamie had done just that. He had fought for his peace, and in the end, he had reclaimed it. No one would ever forget that. The end.